All right, everyone. Welcome to Tiger Talk Thursday. This is actually episode 34, transitioning to life after sports. And we have Dylan Nadler in the house tonight. So he started Taekwondo at the age of 5, competing. He developed a passion for competing and later went on to represent Canada as captain of the national team. Awesome. At just 18 years old, he held the #1 rank in Canada as well as top 40 in the world. Huge congrats there, Dylan. That's amazing. After stepping away from the sport in 2018, he founded MindLock, a mental training company developed for high performance athletes. Almost 6 years later, MindLock has worked with hundreds of athletes across 15 countries and organizations like the UFC, CFL, NCAA, Olympics, and more. So welcome, Dylan. We're excited to have you join the conversation. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm great. So this conversation came forth, around the conversation with athletes struggling in silence, and the mission and vision of all athletes that are contributing is that we can let people know that there is a community here. It is perfectly normal, because a lot of people identify with their sport, and when they stop, whether it be due to injury, unforeseen circumstances, or retirement that forces them to hang up the jersey, it's kind of like, who am I now? So let's go back. I mean, you started at 5. At 18, you're basically #1 in Canada. Tell us about that journey, and then let's talk about what it was like when you stopped.
Yeah, for sure. So, I started martial arts. I was doing Taekwondo. My parents put me in when I was 5, with no expectations. I think like most parents, they just wanted me to be fit and like, learn how to defend myself and whatever. And I very quickly developed this passion and obsession with the sparring side, with the competing side.
Okay.
But the problem with where I was at in terms of like my gym was that it wasn't really a place that developed like competitors. I think a lot of martial arts gyms, whether it's Taekwondo, karate, whatever, it's great for like a workout and you work your way through the belts, but it's hard to find like somewhere that's really competition oriented. And I wasn't there. And it was frustrating for a long time. And I ended up making a switch and leaving, the club I was at for, 5 or 6 years and switching to a different one that was really geared at high performance. So I kind of went from like a big fish in a microscopic pond to, really realizing quickly that like, man, I have a black belt, but I'm like no good pretty much. So that was tough, like relearning everything and being humbled in that sense. And, I was surrounded by other people my age. We were all like 12, 13. We were traveling a lot, competing a lot. And I realized like, okay, this is something I really want to do.
Can
I
we
just
back up there for a second? So you said you have a black belt, but you feel like you were starting over. So what gaps did you, like you said, they weren't training the competitor side, or can you explain that a little bit more for the listeners? Because I find that very interesting.
Yeah, so think about a belt system in especially the traditional striking martial arts like Taekwondo, karate, like 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 school, you do your classes, you understand the concepts and you progress. But I think a lot of people associate martial arts with combat and competing and like you're learning the fundamentals, kicks and punches and stuff like that, but it's not really meant for or oriented towards like going out there and competing in like Olympic style sparring.
Yeah.
To get It's not like other sports, like when you play soccer knowing that you want to compete in soccer.
Yeah.
When you play basketball, you want to compete. Martial arts, you don't have to compete, and actually most don't. A lot of people,
It's
there's a lot
just
of
for
people out
themselves.
there. Yeah, they have like a yellow belt in Taekwondo or whatever, and they quit and they didn't compete. They just kind of did the stuff to get the belts, and that's most people who do sports like that or martial arts like that. So I had my black belt. I got my black belt when I was 10, but like from a competition
Don't mess
standpoint,
with
like,
Dylan.
well, I mean, you could have at that time because I really didn't know, too much. I had just been in it long enough. So when I switched to a competition oriented gym, that's when I learned, okay, like what I've learned doesn't really translate into the competition side. I need to kind of
Interesting.
relearn everything.
And like, give me what would be one thing that you had to develop from the gym before to the gym after?
I mean, I can give you somebody else's opinion. So I remember one of my first days there, and I was training with everybody, and one of the other parents in the waiting area, I think, looked at my dad and said something along the lines of like, "Is he really a black belt? Like he doesn't look like a black belt." And to be fair, like he was kind of right. And I think to your question too of like what's one thing that stood out. I remember I was watching one of the classes, I think like a couple of days before I joined, and one of the instructors there was talking about like look at yourself in the mirror, do some fake motions. Like when you're about to throw a kick, what do your shoulders do? What do your hips do? So if you want to
Mm,
throw somebody off and make it look like you're about to throw a strike, you kind of fake with that same look. And I was
got
like,
it.
my mind was blown. I was like, wait, there's like strategy to this thing.
Yeah.
It's not just like go, 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 go. So that was one thing too, not just with the technical side that I had to work on, but I was like, there's a strategy, there's game plan. So there were a bunch of different components that got thrown at me right away. And
Yeah, that's
I
really
kind of
interesting. I mean,
stuck
makes
with it. Yeah.
sense. That's cool. Yeah, so just learning how to be a competitor in the sport for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. It was definitely like a starting over process, but I was so passionate, around it that for me, it was like the only thing that I wanted to do. And I knew that if I worked hard enough, I could be at a place where I was in line with all the other teammates I had, if not better down the line.
I love it. So how old would you have been here? Did you say 10?
I was grade 7 when I made the
Okay.
jump. So I was probably, it was 2011. I think I was about 12 at
Okay.
that point. And then I remember my first week that I joined that club, everybody on the competition team was preparing for nationals that year. So nationals were in Winnipeg. And the first week I joined, they were preparing to leave. And that part too blew my mind. I was like, wait a second, like these people are like getting on a plane and like representing Team Ontario, and they're gonna
Yeah.
fight like at nationals. And for me, I was like, okay, like I need this. Like by this time next year, like that has to be me. And anyway, it
Love it.
was. And it was cool to kind of have that full circle moment where I got to represent Team Ontario and win nationals the next year. But that
Yeah.
was a moment too. I was like, okay, this is cool. Like they're serious.
Yeah, well, and I mean, and clearly you rose the ranks very quickly, being number one in Canada and top 40 in the world. So when you're in that space, now obviously with MindLock, you do deal with mental fitness and all the things. Were you aware of your mindset at that time, or was it looking back after you left sport that you really developed this? When did you start having your first awareness on the mental side? I mean, I find martial arts in general, they are more focused on mindset as it is as a practice. Would you agree based on your experience?
Yeah, I think, the nice thing about martial arts is there's a tradition to it. It's
Mm,
very traditional in the sense where it comes from, these like ancient places, and they learn it
yeah,
thousands of years old. There's tenets that you follow. So being a good martial artist isn't just about being an athlete. It's about being a good person,
yeah,
having respect for yourself and, courage and all those different kind of character traits. So martial arts is great for building like character traits. And I think that's why a lot of parents put their kids in stuff like that,
yeah.
especially like the older school ones. I think for me, it was, I think my early kind of adoption of some of these mental training skills is what let me kind of rise so quickly. I think especially considering I really wasn't anything special on the physical side. Like I was, definitely strong and fast and whatever, but not like the most or the best. So I think part of my understanding was if I'm here and I want to be up here and there's this gap I need to follow, but I'm doing the same things physically that everyone around me is doing. How
Mm.
am I going to bridge this gap? And for me, that was stuff on the mental side. So it was reading different books, it was
Ah,
visualizing, it
I
was
love
going
this.
into the self-talk. And I was like, this is my only way to kind of catch up.
Yeah,
And I think that's something that, allowed me to rise, and climb the ranks so quickly is that I knew when it came time to competition, not only was I physically there, but I was mentally there. And, I had an intensity and a courage I could rely on. And it was hard to kind of throw me off of my game. And I would game plan with things in mind. I would look at my opponents and I wouldn't just look at kind of their physical attributes. I would try to dig deeper and look at things that would irritate them and set them off so I could kind of take advantage of those vulnerabilities when I fought them. And I just like tried to look
I
at it
love it.
through multiple lenses. And I think that's something that helped me get to that next level very quickly.
I love it. You're speaking my language. Totally. Because so did you physically see, and not to make anyone feel bad that maybe competed against you or that was that you were going up against? I mean, did you see someone who is, physically had it all, but mentally you just were able to because of this work? And I mean, I want to go back to the specifics of what you're talking about, because I talk a lot about, internal versus external validation. I talk a lot about self-talk. I talk a lot about visualization and all these techniques as well. So I love what you're doing, because I think with billions of athletes in the world, there's not enough of us to even clear the globe in this lifetime. So I'm so excited with all the people that I'm speaking to that are doing this type of work. I think it's such a blessing for athletes that are up and coming. But talk to me about that. Did you have someone where you were like, physically, this guy should have kicked my ass, but because of my mindset, you were able to either outwork them, outsmart them? Did you have those experiences?
Yeah, I'll tell you a story if you want. So
Yeah,
I
love stories.
one of the biggest kind of international competitions that's like open class. It's not like Olympic Games or World Championships or whatever. Is It's the U.S. Open, and I had won the U.S. Open in 2014. So it was 2015. It was the next year, same tournament, and I had the confidence in myself that I could do it, but I also had, a lot of tough competition. There was a lot of, kind of talented people. I was in a weight division that was like pretty common. So it was like a huge division. And my, I made my way through the tree. I had like 5 different fights to get to the finals, but they were like very tough. Like they were close, they were back and forth. I definitely kind of struggled in certain points. And the person on the other side of the tree who I ended up meeting the finals, in Taekwondo at the time, there's a rule where it's like a point gap, like mercy rule. So if you're up by a certain amount of points after round two, they just waive it and they say, okay, like, fight's done, because it's
Okay.
just, it's
It's just
too
not fair to the
dominant.
other
It's
competitors.
exactly. So while I'm kind of scraping my way through, my competition, the guy on the other side of the bracket, without exaggeration, every single fight he had won by this mercy rule. So,
Wow.
coming together, there were a few ways I can look at it, right? I mean, obviously the self-doubt creeps in. It's like, what makes me think I'm capable? Like, of course I have the proof that I'd won this tournament before, but again, this guy's a beast, he's not just beating people, he's like demolishing people. And there's me fighting my way through. If you look at it just from like an objective lens, like, why would I think that I have a chance against somebody like this? And I remember the thing that I said to myself and how I kind of reframed it is I said, you know what? I'm going to use this to my advantage. I've had to face this adversity all day. This guy hasn't tasted any sort of that obstacle yet, any sort of adversity. He's had this easy walk to the finals where nobody's pushed him, nobody's made him doubt himself, nobody's even challenged him. I think the moment this fight starts and he realizes that he's not going to be able to walk through me, the
Mm,
moment he realizes that I'm going to stand in his way and make this hard for him, I think there's going to be a part of him that breaks and thinks maybe I can't do this. So
mm.
that was my way of kind of using more of a mental strategy of, the momentum is on his side. How can I kind of obstruct that? And I'm like, you know what? The benefit to me, the silver lining here is that because I've faced my adversity, I'm ready for this. He hasn't tasted that yet. I'm going to be the first one to kind of ruin his day. And that's exactly how it went. I ended up kind of just outclassing him from the beginning and, winning the tournament and becoming one of the first Canadians to win the US Open back to back, which was awesome.
That's amazing. Congratulations. I love
Thanks.
that. And so, I mean, this topic, it's life after sports, and we hear all different sorts of things from athletes out there. And it's not all everybody struggles. I mean, some people can transition into other work and then they notice some sort of something later on in life where they really kind of have that identity struggle. But 18, you step away from your sport. Curious, what caused you to step away, and talk to us about MindLock.
Yeah, good question. So for me, my mind was always set on Tokyo 2020. That's something in a sport like Taekwondo, which is an amateur sport. There's nothing professional that you can kind of like do after that. It's not like football, basketball, baseball. You turn pro, it becomes a career. With amateur sports, a lot of martial arts, unless you're in MMA and you want to go into the UFC and stuff like that, it's pretty much like Olympics, World Championships. Those are like the top tier things.
Yeah.
So for me, Tokyo 2020 was always the goal that I had. And it was looking like it was going to be pretty realistic based off of, where my ranking was and how old I was at the time. Some things kind of happened where I had some teammates that kind of quit or switched clubs. My coach at the time had a family, had a baby, and he had to take some time away. And one of my best friends and teammates, we switched to a different club for a little bit to get some more looks. And things were just like not how they were leading up to that point.
Got
And
it.
then I also kind of for the first time in my life had to think ahead and say, well, I'm, in my first or second year of university. I'm kind of working right now. Like, what's it going to take for me to make that final push and qualify for these Olympics? Not just qualify, but perform well, which is always the
Hmm.
goal. I realized, okay, I'm going to have to quit whatever job I have because I have to train full time. That's what people do, train 2, 3 times a week. I have to, cut off all my relationships with my friends, family, any
Yeah.
sort of like relationships I have, can't be a thing. I have to drop out of school because I have to do this full time. Like it was a very much so fork in the road of, do I give this everything I've got and drop everything, or
Hmm.
do I not? And up until then, every point in my life, whether it was elementary school, high school, early university, it was a no brainer. It's like, it's worth it. It's always worth it. I don't care what sacrifices I have to make. this was the first time where I was like, okay, let's say it all works out and I go to these Olympics and I medal and I come back, but I don't have a degree, I don't have a job. There's no way to really leverage this. I mean, there's tons of ways to leverage it, but not in like a professional sense of becoming like a pro athlete. It's not that type of thing. It was the first time in my life where I was like, I don't know if it's worth it. And the thing too is I had seen so many of my teammates, so many of my peers stick in the sport too long
Mm.
and build up this resentment for it. And for me, I was like, this is my life. Like, I love Taekwondo more than anything. It's made me who I am as a person. The last thing I want to do is build this resentment for something that's brought me so much. Maybe it's better to walk away from it before I become bitter, because it's so easy, to stick in it too long. You make
Hmm.
these sacrifices, you don't live up to the expectations you had for yourself, and you end up hating the thing that you loved so much. And between all those variables happening kind of at the same time, I was like, you know what? This is tough, but like, I think for everybody's sake and my own sake, like, I'm ready for this. And I think that's what made it a little bit easier being my decision. It wasn't like an injury setback. It wasn't anything like that. I kind of like got to
That's a
make that
pretty
choice for
mature
myself.
decision to make at that age, I think, to have that knowledge. Like, did somebody mentor you through that, or was that just your own thought process at the time? You started looking at the bigger picture. Are you someone who always kind of looked at the long game versus just what was right in front of you, or?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely my own insights. And I think I only verbalized it once I had decided, pretty much. I think I'm not really one to talk about things as I'm thinking about them. I think I work through it and then I'll, talk about it once it's there. But yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, I've always been the type of person to think about things from as many angles as I can. And, going back to me as a competitor, I think that's what, kind of helped me
your competitive
become as
advantage.
successful as I was.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly too. So that's again what made it easier. Emphasis on the because it's never easy, but it was my choice, and I can live with that. But again, there's challenges that come with that, as you know too, more than anybody else. But I was glad that I got to kind of go out on my own.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of these conversations, you don't hear that. You hear a lot of injury or retirement or some unforeseen circumstance that forces them to hang up the jersey. Okay. And now 6 years later, I mean, you're working with hundreds of athletes across 15 countries in organizations like the UFC, CFL, NCAA, Olympics, and more. Super impressive. This is a topic that I'm wildly passionate about. Tell us about MindLock and what you're seeing in the athletes that you're working with. And
Yeah,
amazing that you are doing this as well. I love that
yeah.
there's
Thanks a
others
lot.
doing that.
I think, for me, traveling a lot and experiencing other kind of national team programs and seeing the way people train, I always saw that, like, I was interested early on that, like, well, every team has a strength and conditioning coach and a chiropractor and a
Yeah.
nutritionist, but they never have anything on the mental side. And for me, it was those mental skills that helped me become so successful. And I was like, there's something missing here. How come this isn't as mainstream as it is? And I always had an interest in kind of like sports psychology, like my eighth grade yearbook, where it says, what do you want to be in 20 years? And everybody says like actor, lawyer, police. Mine said like sports psychologist. So
Did
like,
it? Did
even
it?
from,
Did it
yeah,
really? Yeah.
yeah. So even from like, being 11, 12, like, I always wanted to do something like that. And having the extra sport experience went a long way to help. So as soon as I stopped competing, I was like, okay, this is something that I think could be helpful. It's something I think I could be good at. I think that other people could benefit from it. I'm going to try it out. I mean, this could crash and burn and not be a success, and that's okay. Or it
Yeah.
could be great. Like, I'm just going to give it a shot and see what happens and not overthink it. And that was, yeah, like almost 6 years ago.
I love it. I love it. And what would you say? So are you dealing mostly with athletes in sport?
I would say, yeah,
Yeah.
mostly are high performance athletes. There's a few non-athletes, like people in business, entrepreneurs, stuff like that too. Because I mean, as you know, mental skills translate into a
Yeah.
whole bunch of things, but mostly athletes.
Would you agree that a lot of times it stems back to belief of self and confidence and having that clarity of thought or the vision so that they can step in the right direction towards their goals? Or what would you say would be a commonality? I mean, I know everyone's different. We all come from a different background, experiences, traumas that shape us into who we are, experiences and all those things. But what would you find is a common topic that you are dealing with the athletes that you are coaching?
I think what's interesting about the athletes that I work with for the most part is that I think a misconception, and I think you might find this too with like any sort of mental training, is that you come into it with a flaw or a deficiency, and I think that's part of the stigma is it's like, I have confidence issues or I have motivation issues. And like, of course, there's plenty of people that are like that. And there's tons of things you can do to help. But there's also a bigger market for people that are like, I don't really struggle with anything, but I
I just
want to
want to
be
get to the
better.
next level. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's like you don't have to go through a really
Yeah.
bad injury to like do like strength and conditioning
Yeah.
and like work out. Like you just do it to be better, right?
Yeah.
So it's like you take somebody that is already really good at their sport. It doesn't mean you just stop doing it, right? So it's the
For
same thing
sure.
on the mental side. You could be extremely confident, extremely self-motivated, and still come into something like this with
Yeah.
something to gain. So for me, I always like to take it through like a very like tangible standpoint of what can we develop, how can we show that it works, how can we format it in ways that are repetitive. You can apply it in training, you can apply it in competitions, a lot of like kind of goal setting things, self-talk, identity statements, all those different types of things that you can just use to make an impact right away. But
Yep.
yeah, back to your point, self-belief is everything. If you at the end of the day don't believe fully that you're capable of what you need to do, there's going to be some limiting beliefs that slow you down. And whether you compete in an individual sport or a team sport, at the end of the
Yeah.
day, it's just you out there, right? You have so much control over certain things, other things you don't. And the bottom line is, if you think you can do it, what's the quote? They say, if you think you can or you can't, you're right
Yeah.
either way,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
where that belief system comes from. And I think that has to be the underlying belief for everything.
No, I mean, I believe that wholeheartedly. And it's interesting. And I hear this from some people where they watch some of my interviews and they're like, it's interesting too, to notice how many successful people, as well do struggle behind and that's a big thing that I want to nail home to a lot of people is we're human. We're going to have imposter syndrome. We're going to have self-doubt, but through these techniques, you can build the belief and the confidence through taking action and obviously looking at your daily habits and routines and where is this self-talk coming from? Is this something that you've grown up with and been told and your external words became your internal words, or you know what I mean? So I think it's so cool what you're doing. And I love that you made that distinction between, we don't always have to be, not everybody's suffering. You don't have to always be in this like traumatic position to want to be better. So that's really cool. I'm glad you brought that up because that's important to remind everyone of as well. What else is there? If someone was struggling, they've left sport, and I feel like when I've spoken to some other athletes, I've asked, when did you know when it was like they had gone through a little bit of a depression or they didn't know who they were and they had to obviously do some introspection and self-reflection. And it was one interview with Kurt David, who is a basketball professional, and he won an Emmy Award for the Glory Days, and he interviewed athletes. He said at some point you just get so tired of losing and you're kind of ready to start winning again. What is it when you hear that statement? What comes up for you?
Are you talking about while they're still competing?
When they're done after sport. So like for people that are transitioning to life after sport, because I was asking, when people start to turn it around, like from the mindset piece, you kind of had that emotional moment where you're like, all right,
Right.
enough's enough. I've had my pity party.
Yeah, yeah,
I've
yeah.
ignored the world, obviously, especially when you're in a professional sport where you are a face that everyone knows. I mean, it's tough to go through those things in private, right?
Yep.
What advice would you have, or what would that mean to you when you hear that?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, it happens all the time, right? I think everybody struggles with identity after sport. I mean, I did for sure. You ask yourself, it's like, well, if I'm not an athlete, if I'm not a fighter, if I'm not a basketball, like what am I? Like your
Yeah.
whole life, you're one thing. Every time you go to a family gathering, oh, hey, how's your sport? How's whatever. And like that's always the
It's
conversation. And then it's
true.
kind of weird you're kind of like, am I normal now? I think back to kind of one of the most recent conversations I had with a client about this too, who was transitioning. And I think one thing that made them feel better is I said, you take those ingredients that made you successful in sport and you apply those to anything that you want to do. And there's no reason why you can't be as successful. I said, you're not special because you were an elite athlete. You were an elite athlete because you were special first. And if you just take those concepts and you take those core things and fundamentals that made you who you were and you apply it to anything, why can't you see that same amount of success? Whether it's self-motivation, it's that drive, it's that passion, it's that relentlessness, it's that, indomitable spirit that you have to keep pushing on. All these different things, like the ingredients that make you special as an athlete, will continue to make you special in anything that you do. It's just reminding yourself, like, I'm not special because of what I did before. It's like I got to that level because I had something in me that I can just apply to something new now.
Yeah, and you know what? You just nailed it on the head. I mean, we always talk about sports are what you do. They are not who you are. For anyone that's, struggling with transitioning to life after sports, or you've gotten injured and you've been sidelined for whatever reason, and you're needing a new perspective. I mean, mindset work. What would be your top three items for people if they were brand new to mindset work? They've been great athletes from the neck down, and I do believe there is a shift happening in our culture around the world that people are waking up to the need for the mental fitness side, which is awesome to see because again, there's so many athletes around the globe. We couldn't get to everyone in our lifetime. But what would be your top three things that you would recommend someone do? Let's say they have never done any mindset work. They're great athletes, but they just have never done it. What would you recommend they do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think number one, easy off the top, is setting, specific and meaningful goals. That's something that I think everybody's done at some point or another. I think sometimes with varied degrees of success. I think the way that I like to do it is I like to focus on goals from two different perspectives. Number one is you look at kind of like the physical representation of those goals. So if you're a basketball player, you might say in practice, I want to work on my 3-point shot. I want to work on my cardio. I want to work on my spacing, whatever, right? So you have kind of the physical component of a goal
Yeah.
that can, extend into the competition. It can extend into training, whatever. But the way I like to spin it as well is add an attitude or a mental component to those goals, which is, if the physical component is what do I need to do to be successful, the attitude component is how do I need to feel to make that happen? So, for example, if you say I want to play a good game, how do you need to feel to make that happen? Do you need to be confident? Do you need to be focused? Do you need to be relaxed? Right. So, thinking
Yeah.
of goals from two different perspectives, which is what do I need to do physically to, push the ball forward and find success? And also, how do I even need to feel first? Right.
I
So, if you
love that
wake
you
up,
said the feeling part. It's something we talk about too. So it's amazing. And when it comes from it's so much easier for someone to answer that question, how do I need to feel, versus when they're like, oh, I don't know. I don't know where to start or what to do. And think people, it's not just about reading a positive affirmation. It's what do we need to do to set yourself up for success so that you do settle into that calm confidence, right? Where your breathing is, you don't have performance anxiety. Or I love that. Okay. Number one, what's number two?
number two is I would say journaling by far. I think keeping some sort of training journal is like, I think it's one of the most like the ROI on that is like unbelievable because you go to Walmart and you spend $5 on a workbook, you get a pen, you throw it in your training bag. So now you're like what, $6 in, and then the value you get from that is immense because number one, well, I mean, first of all, what are you writing down? So I think after practice, there's different strategies you can use. The one I like to do is, you quickly do a recap of what you did. Not to go too much into that because that can be like really long and not everybody
Yep.
has time to write a ton. The heavier focus is like, how did you feel throughout that practice, right? What were moments that frustrated you? What were moments that you succeeded, you felt great? Adding that component to it, as well as ending it off with how you can kind of build off of it next time. So
Yep.
you very quickly talk about what you did. You most importantly talk about how you felt about what you did, what worked, what didn't work, and then you
Yep.
end it off with how you can build on it next time. I think three things happen when you do that consistently. Number one is you're documenting your progress and you have the ability to go back and look at those things. I think we overestimate our memory and people say, well, I remember my good
Yeah.
practices. But if you say, okay, tell me about training from, June 7th, it's like, I don't know. Right.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
creates this kind of documented log of all the things that you're doing. Number two, it develops your sense of self-awareness, right?
Yep.
You might feel like you know what's going on, but when it comes time to writing down how you felt, you might go, I don't know, like how did I feel? What
Yeah.
did bother me? What did
Or you
frustrate
watch
me?
video and you're like, oh gosh, I didn't realize I looked like that or did that or it executed that way,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it allows you to then in the moment recognize, okay, I'm frustrated right now because I've
Yeah.
actually felt this before. Let me
Hmm.
kind of like disengage and take a step back. So that's number two, you build your self-awareness. Number three is it allows you to identify trends in that information. So one of my favorite quotes, it says you have to collect the dots to connect the dots, right? So the more information you
Love
gather,
it.
the more you can kind of see what's going on with it. So yeah, if you journal for 3 days and then quit, you might not get a ton of info there. If you
Yeah.
journal for 30 days or 2 months or a year, well, then look what happens. You can take a step back. You can look at the month and say, okay, over the month of September or October, what were my three best training sessions? Okay, you go through and you pick those three. What were my three worst? And you pick those three. And then you say, okay, out of those three, let me read those entries and figure out, was there anything about those that were related to each other? Did I do something similar on those 3 days that may have, been a part of what made that so good. And then you do the same thing on the stuff
Your
that was
three
bad.
worst practices, you got in a fight with your spouse or girlfriend and it's shifted your
Exactly. You never
mindset. Like
know.
it's, I know
You
it's,
never know.
that's great info. And it's great to be that self-aware. Yeah, for sure. And then you find the patterns and the triggers. I get that for sure. I love that.
Yeah. So
Okay.
that's a big one too.
Okay. So, and number three, so one, goal setting, two, on the attitude as well as the physical side. Number two, mark down what you were great at, what you need to work on. What's your goal plan, I guess, to how are we going to make that better in the next practice, right? Your intention, is
Yeah.
that what you'd say? And then what is number three?
I would say number three, there's, I think, a few options I could slide into that slot. I think for me, one thing that I really like is going over some sort of like identity statement sheet. And by that, what I mean is going through a list. And the way I like to do it is, think about yourself as an athlete and, describe what you see in terms of like I am statements. So you could say I am, it could be physical things, I am quick, I'm explosive, I'm dynamic. It could be mental things, I'm confident, I'm relaxed, I'm focused. And, writing down a list, and you'd be surprised. I think, off the top, you might think, oh, this is easy, I can come up with a million. When you start writing them down, you start to struggle sooner than you think. And I
Yeah.
think by having an exercise like that, number one, you start to build out this blueprint of what is the, a representation of yourself on paper. It's a very quick way to kind of like lock in. Let's say you're 5 minutes out from a big game, you've done your warm-up, you've done your stretch, you're just kind of nervous, you're waiting around. You could skim through something like that in 30 seconds and be a lot more engaged, a lot more focused. You can extend that. You can do this, let's say, the night before a big game or a
I
big
like how you said
competition.
you lock in. I imagine that has to do with the MindLock title.
There you go. There you
Yeah.
go. You're picking up on the
Yeah.
branding there, the
I like
subliminal
it.
messaging.
Lock in.
But
No, it's true. It's how to get in peak state, right?
yeah, and that's really what it's about too. So I think having, a good list of, what makes you special as an athlete, and it goes back to those, identity we were talking about. What makes you special as an athlete a lot of the time is what makes you special as a person, and having a kind of cheat sheet to look back on anytime you feel nervous or you doubt yourself or you need that reassurance, you're going to listen to yourself more than anybody else. So having something like that goes a long way.
And what's beautiful is you really just gave them a game plan for who they are outside of their sport that they can transition easily into life after sports, right?
Mhm.
So I love that. Well, I mean, you've got tons of great information. Dylan Nadler, everyone. This is episode 34. Any last comments that are on the tip of your tongue, whether you think for an athlete that's competing, what to you do you want to see happen in the mind space of athletes around the world? Like, what's your vision? Because clearly you had this 6 years ago as a vision for yourself and something that you saw a need for athletes, but what's your big vision for what you would like to do in the mental health space of sport?
It's a great question. I think for me, my vision from the beginning was to take something like this, something like mental training, and make it popular, make it cool. The same way that like when you have a good workout, you want to like post about it, right? Like, why can't we make developing yourself on the mental side cool and like make it something that you do want to share? I think, the thing about sports psychology is like it's been around longer than people think. It's just been so clinical for so long. And I think
Mhm.
because it's been like that, it's been kind of buried. It's in the shadows. People really don't want to talk about it, and for me, I think kind of kickstarting this next generation and being a bit of a pioneer, like in that sense, I want to make it cool. I want to make it popular. I want to make it
Yeah.
something that people are like not just not afraid to talk about, but like are encouraged to, because it shows just like anything else, you're serious about what you do. You do a good strength and conditioning session, you post about it because people know you're serious. Why can't you do the same thing, when you're finished with a mental training session? You do some journaling and you post about that. Like, I think that's kind of the next step. And I think that's something that I'm passionate about, is taking something that I know to be so impactful and anybody that participates in it knows to be
Mhm.
impactful, and making it something that's cool, that's popular, that's mainstream, and taking it a bit out of the shadows where it's been for too long, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I love a good journaling session. I'm very wildly passionate about it. And for me, it wasn't necessarily when I played sport, it was going through breast cancer where I got that season of silence, but it was a forced season of silence. And I always tell people, do not wait to go through divorce, bankruptcy, or breast cancer like I did to do this mindset work and to deep dive into who you are. Because I mean, the person you are on the other side is such a it's so rewarding. And I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure you can feel it from the work that you've done on your own mental health. So I'm so grateful that you've contributed to this conversation. Thank you for taking the time to join with me, to join myself and any of the listeners. And I know these conversations are impacting people. There are people watching. And if you are suffering in silence, please know you can reach out to myself. You can reach out to Dylan, MindLock. There is a community here wanting to support you, and that's why these conversations are people are just saying yes to having them. So I'm so grateful that you are contributing to us. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, this was awesome. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm excited to watch you grow and see what you're doing with your business. And I'm really grateful that Keenan said, hey, you got to check out Dylan. So everyone, episode 34, Dylan Nadler, founder of MindLock. Thank you.
Thank you.